whispered words cut through the gilded ballroom like a blade through silk. Anastasia Whitmore would never bear children, and therefore, she would never secure a suitable marriage. At 22, she had become the cautionary tale that mothers shared with their daughters in hushed tones, a living reminder that beauty and breeding meant nothing without the promise of an heir. The grand chandeliers of the Astor mansion cast their brilliant light upon New York's finest families, but they seemed to grow dimmer whenever Anastasia entered their glow, as if even the crystals themselves understood her cursed position in society. The Whitmore family had once commanded respect throughout Manhattan's elite circles, their shipping fortune built through 3 generations of shrewd business dealings and strategic marriages. Anastasia's father, Cornelius Whitmore, maintained his position on the boards of several prominent banks, while her mother, Eleanor, had been considered one of the most accomplished hostesses of her generation. Their Fifth Avenue mansion stood as a testament to their success, its marble halls filled with European art and furnishings that spoke of refinement and taste. Yet all of this grandeur felt hollow when society's matrons dismissed Anastasia with barely concealed pity, their daughters moving past her as if her condition might prove contagious. The diagnosis had come from Dr. Pemberton 3 years prior, delivered with the cold precision that only the city's most esteemed physician could muster. A riding accident in her youth had left damage that, while invisible to the eye, rendered her prospects for motherhood virtually impossible. The news had traveled through society's intricate network of gossip faster than any scandal, transforming her from one of the season's most promising young ladies into an object of whispered speculation. Potential suitors who had once competed for her attention suddenly found urgent business elsewhere, their interest evaporating like morning mist beneath the harsh light of practical considerations. Eleanor Whitmore had initially fought against society's cruel judgment with the fierce determination of a mother protecting her young. She had arranged private consultations with specialists from Boston and Philadelphia, seeking second opinions that might restore hope to their family's future. When medical science offered no reprieve, she had attempted to position Anastasia's other qualities as compensations for her perceived deficiency, emphasizing her daughter's musical talents, her knowledge of literature, and her fluency in French and Italian. These efforts only served to highlight what society viewed as her fundamental failure, turning accomplishments that should have been assets into reminders of what could never be enough. The social season continued its relentless march, each ball and reception serving as another arena where Anastasia's isolation grew more pronounced. Young men who might have overlooked her condition in private found themselves unwilling to risk public association with someone society had already deemed unsuitable. Their mothers, those formidable guardians of family legacies, made their disapproval clear through subtle but unmistakable gestures that spoke louder than any direct confrontation. Dance cards remained conspicuously empty, while lesser beauties found themselves surrounded by eager partners, the mathematics of marriageability reducing Anastasia's worth to a simple equation that always yielded the same devastating result. The Whitmore family's attempts to maintain their social standing became increasingly desperate as the months passed. Cornelius had considered increasing Anastasia's dowry substantially, believing that financial incentives might overcome biological limitations. But Eleanor had convinced him that such obvious bribery would only confirm society's worst assumptions about their daughter's prospects. They continued to attend every significant social gathering, maintaining the facade of confidence while privately agonizing over each slight, each turned back, each whispered comment that reached their ears despite the speaker's attempts at discretion. Anastasia herself had developed a careful mask of composure that she wore to each social function, her smile never faltering even as her heart withered with each passing rejection. She had learned to position herself strategically at the edges of ballrooms, close enough to participate when politeness demanded but far enough away to avoid the cruel comparisons that inevitably arose when she stood too near the season's more favored debutantes. Her conversations had become exercises in deflection, steering discussions away from topics of marriage and children, toward safer subjects that wouldn't invite speculation about her personal circumstances. The weight of carrying her family's disappointed hopes had begun to transform Anastasia in ways that went beyond the obvious social consequences. She found herself studying other young women with a mixture of envy and scientific curiosity, wondering what invisible quality they possessed that she so obviously lacked. Sleep became elusive as her mind replayed countless interactions, searching for signs of hope that simply weren't there. The mirror reflected back a face that remained beautiful, but seemed somehow diminished, as if society's judgment had physically altered her appearance in ways that only she could perceive. Private moments with her parents had become exercises in careful avoidance, each family dinner proceeding without direct acknowledgement of the crisis that consumed their thoughts. Cornelius would discuss business matters with forced enthusiasm, while Eleanor maintained elaborate plans for future social events, both of them desperately clinging to normalcy, while their daughter's prospects crumbled around them. Anastasia participated in these conversations with the same careful grace she displayed in public, protecting her parents from the full weight of her despair while privately questioning whether their family would ever recover from the shame she had brought upon them. The arrival of invitations continued to slow as hostesses found increasingly creative excuses to exclude the Whitmores from their guest lists. Those events they still attended felt like performances where every gesture was scrutinized, every word weighed for its potential to either improve or worsen their already precarious position. Anastasia had begun to recognize the subtle signs that preceded each rejection. The brief hesitation before greetings, the careful spacing that others maintained around her, the way conversations died when she approached groups of her former friends. The approaching Newport season loomed before them like a final judgment, the summer colony representing society's ultimate test of acceptance or exile. Families who failed to secure invitations to the right houses found themselves effectively banished from elite circles, their social death as complete as any physical demise. Eleanor had spent weeks crafting letters to old friends, calling in favors accumulated over decades of careful relationship building, desperate to ensure that Anastasia would have at least some opportunities to redeem herself before society's final verdict was rendered. Yet beneath all the carefully maintained hope and determination, a terrible truth was beginning to crystallize in the minds of all three Whitmores. Their world was changing in ways that seemed beyond their power to control, and the life they had always expected Anastasia to live was slipping away with each passing day, leaving them to confront a future that none of them had ever imagined or prepared themselves to face. The ballroom at Mrs. Vanderbilt's mansion seemed to pulse with the collective heartbeat of New York's most powerful families. But for Anastasia, each rhythm felt like a death knell announcing her social execution. She stood near the magnificent windows overlooking Central Park, watching couples glide across the polished floor while she remained as still as a portrait, beautiful but untouchable. The emerald silk of her Worth gown, imported specifically for this evening, seemed to mock her circumstances with its elegance, serving as expensive wrapping for a gift that no one desired to unwrap. Her mother's desperate optimism had convinced her to attend yet another gathering, where she would serve as little more than a living reminder of what happened when nature failed to cooperate with society's expectations. Eleanor Whitmore moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of a woman accustomed to commanding social situations. But tonight, her efforts felt forced, each smile requiring tremendous effort to maintain. She had spent the afternoon calling upon influential matrons, attempting to secure dance partners for Anastasia through appeals to old friendships and carefully worded requests that stopped just short of begging. The responses had been uniformly polite and utterly devastating, each refusal couched in language so carefully diplomatic that it somehow hurt more than direct cruelty would have. Mrs. Astor herself had delivered the final blow with exquisite courtesy, explaining that while she held the Whitmore family in the highest regard, she simply couldn't encourage her sons to pursue attachments that society would inevitably view as imprudent. The evening progressed with mechanical precision, as Anastasia watched former friends dance with young men who had once sought her attention, their happiness serving as a cruel contrast to her own isolation. Lady Margaret Thornton, barely 18 and possessed of unremarkable beauty, found herself surrounded by admirers whose intentions were obvious to everyone present. Her success seemed to magnify Anastasia's failure. each laugh from Margaret's circle of suitors echoing across the ballroom like a judgment upon those who could never inspire such devoted attention. The mathematics of social value had never been more brutally clear, reducing every young woman to her capacity for producing the next generation of society's elite. Dr. Pemberton's presence at the gathering served as an unwelcome reminder of the medical verdict that had sealed Anastasia's fate. His very existence in the same room feeling like an accusation. She had overheard whispered conversations about his growing reputation as a specialist in women's medical concerns, his opinions carrying weight that could determine entire family futures with a few carefully chosen words. The irony that the same man who had destroyed her prospects now danced attendance upon families whose daughters remained blissfully unaware of their good fortune struck her as particularly cruel, a reminder that medical knowledge could crush dreams as easily as it could preserve them. Cornelius Whitmore stood among a group of prominent businessmen near the card room. His conversation focused on railroad investments and shipping concerns, while his eyes periodically sought out his daughter across the crowded ballroom. His attempts to engage potential suitors in business discussions that might eventually lead to more personal topics had begun to feel increasingly desperate. Each interaction requiring more elaborate strategies to achieve what had once happened naturally. The realization that his considerable fortune and business connections couldn't overcome his daughter's perceived deficiency had shaken his faith in the very foundations of the society he had spent his life navigating successfully. The orchestra's waltz seemed to emphasize the rhythm of Anastasia's exclusion as she watched other young women being claimed for dance after dance, while her own card remained embarrassingly empty. Mrs. Pembroke's daughter, a plain girl with an unfortunate complexion but unquestioned fertility, found herself engaged for every set while Anastasia stood forgotten against the wall like an expensive ornament that had fallen from fashion. The contrast felt deliberately cruel, as if the universe itself was determined to demonstrate exactly how little her other qualities mattered when weighed against society's single overwhelming requirement. Eleanor's increasingly frantic attempts to involve Anastasia in conversations with the season's mothers had begun to backfire spectacularly, each interaction serving to highlight rather than minimize her daughter's disadvantages. The careful questions about travel plans and cultural interests barely concealed the underlying calculation that every woman in the room was performing, weighing Anastasia's obvious assets against her fundamental liability and finding the equation lacking. Even the kindest responses carried undertones of pity that cut deeper than outright hostility, transforming former friends into reluctant participants in her social funeral. The realization that her very presence had become a source of embarrassment for her parents struck Anastasia with devastating clarity as she observed their increasingly strained efforts on her behalf. Every forced smile, every desperate conversational gambit, every carefully orchestrated introduction served to emphasize how far their family had fallen from its former position of strength. She found herself calculating the distance to the mansion's exit, wondering if anyone would notice if she simply disappeared into the night, rather than continue this elaborate charade of hopeful participation in a game where the rules had been permanently changed against her. The evening's entertainment, a series of musical performances by the season's most accomplished young ladies, provided another opportunity for Anastasia to demonstrate talents that no longer seemed to matter in the cruel arithmetic of marriage prospects. Her performance of a complex Chopin nocturne earned polite applause, but she could feel the audience's indifference beneath their courtesy, their attention already shifting to more promising candidates before her final notes had faded. Artistic accomplishments that should have enhanced her appeal instead seemed to emphasize what society viewed as her tragic waste of potential, beauty, and talent, rendered meaningless by biological circumstances beyond her control. The gradual exodus of eligible young men from the ballroom, as the evening progressed, served as a visible reminder of how thoroughly Anastasia had been dismissed from consideration. They departed to attend less formal gatherings, where their behavior could be more relaxed, leaving behind only those suitors whose own circumstances rendered them less selective in their romantic pursuits. The knowledge that she had been relegated to the company of society's less desirable bachelors felt like another death, each small defeat accumulating until the weight of them threatened to crush what remained of her spirit. As midnight approached, the Whitmore family prepared for their departure with the careful choreography of people who had learned to mask their devastation behind perfect manners. Eleanor gathered her silk wrap with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, while Cornelius settled their accounts with a generosity that felt compensatory rather than genuine. Anastasia moved through the final social pleasantries like a beautifully dressed automaton, her responses perfectly calibrated to maintain the illusion that nothing had changed, even as everyone present understood that everything had. The carriage ride home proceeded in silence, broken only by the sound of wheels against cobblestones, and the occasional distant laughter from other vehicles carrying families whose evenings had concluded more successfully. Each of the Whitmores sat alone with their thoughts, processing the evening's fresh disappointments, while trying to maintain some semblance of hope for future occasions that might prove less devastating. The gas lamps lining Fifth Avenue cast moving shadows through the carriage windows, their light seeming to flicker in rhythm with Anastasia's fading dreams of the life she had always expected to live. The morning newspapers delivered their verdict with the casual cruelty that only society columnists could muster, their observations about the previous evening's gatherings reading like obituaries for social aspirations that had died in public view. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore discovered the devastating assessment while taking her morning tea, the delicate china cup trembling in her hands as she read the carefully coded language that announced her daughter's complete expulsion from polite consideration. The columnist had noted with pointed precision that certain young ladies seemed to be struggling with the natural progression toward matrimonial prospects. Their continued presence at social gatherings, beginning to create uncomfortable situations for all involved parties. Anastasia herself learned of her public humiliation through the whispered conversations of household staff who believed themselves unobserved, their gossip carrying up the mansion's marble staircase with devastating clarity. The cook's daughter, employed as a kitchen maid, had overheard discussions at the servants' entrance that confirmed what Anastasia had already suspected. Her name had become synonymous with failure throughout the city's social circles. Even the domestic help understood that serving in the Whitmore household had become a liability, their association with the family threatening their own prospects for advancement within New York's interconnected network of elite residences. The final blow arrived in the form of a perfectly polite letter from Mrs. Caroline Astor herself, written on cream-colored stationery that seemed to gleam with malicious satisfaction as Eleanor read its contents with growing horror. The message, couched in language of exquisite courtesy, effectively barred Anastasia from the season's most important gatherings by explaining that guest lists had become necessarily selective due to space constraints and family obligations. The subtext was unmistakably clear. Anastasia Whitmore was no longer welcome in the inner circles of New York society, her presence considered detrimental to the comfortable atmosphere that such events required. Cornelius Whitmore's attempt to salvage his daughter's reputation through business leverage backfired spectacularly when his carefully orchestrated meeting with prominent families was met with polite but firm resistance that bordered on outright rejection. His offers to increase investments in various family enterprises were received with the kind of diplomatic courtesy reserved for inappropriate proposals, each refusal delivered with such exquisite politeness that it somehow emphasized the magnitude of his desperation. The realization that his considerable financial influence couldn't overcome society's biological imperatives struck him like a physical blow, leaving him speechless in his own study while his carefully constructed world crumbled around him. The social invitations that had once arrived daily began to dwindle to nothing with shocking rapidity, each day's post serving as another confirmation of their family's precipitous fall from grace. Eleanor found herself staring at the empty silver tray, where calling cards and social correspondence had once accumulated, the silence seeming to mock her decades of careful relationship cultivation. Even their oldest friends began to find excuses for their absence from events that had once been unthinkable to attend without the Whitmore family's participation, their loyalty evaporating under society's relentless pressure to maintain proper standards. Dr. Pemberton's professional obligations brought him to the Whitmore mansion for what would become the most devastating consultation of Anastasia's life, his presence serving as a cruel reminder of the medical verdict that had initiated their family's social destruction. His examination confirmed what everyone already knew, while somehow making it feel fresh and more final, his clinical language stripping away the last vestiges of hope that had sustained them through months of declining prospects. The doctor's recommendation that Anastasia consider alternative paths for her life felt like a death sentence delivered with scientific precision, each word calculated to destroy whatever remained of her resistance to the new reality. The revelation that several families had begun actively warning their sons against any association with Anastasia struck the Whitmores like a coordinated attack designed to ensure their complete isolation from respectable society. Mrs. Vanderbilt's daughter had apparently been instructed to avoid even casual conversation with Anastasia at public gatherings, while the Belmont family had issued similar directives to their social circle. The systematic nature of their exclusion suggested a level of organized rejection that went beyond individual family decisions, representing instead a collective judgment that rendered their situation hopeless. Eleanor's desperate attempt to secure alternative social connections through charitable organizations resulted in another humiliating rejection when she discovered that even philanthropic work required approval from the same women who had already deemed her daughter unsuitable for their primary social functions. The Ladies' Aid Society, which had once welcomed Whitmore family participation with enthusiasm, now found reasons to postpone Anastasia's involvement indefinitely, their excuses transparent enough to emphasize the intentional nature of her exclusion. The message was clear. No aspect of respectable society remained open to those who had been deemed fundamentally deficient. Anastasia's own attempt to confront her situation directly by visiting former friends resulted in a series of encounters so painful that she returned home convinced that death would be preferable to continued existence in her current circumstances. Lady Margaret Thornton, once her closest confidant, had received her with the kind of strained politeness reserved for unwelcome callers, their conversation proceeding with such obvious discomfort that both women understood their friendship had become another casualty of society's cruel mathematics. The realization that even genuine affection couldn't overcome social pressure left Anastasia feeling more isolated than she had thought possible. The staff at the Whitmore mansion began to display subtle signs of unease that suggested their family's social death had begun to affect even those paid to serve them, their behavior growing increasingly formal as they distanced themselves from what appeared to be a sinking ship. The housekeeper's daughter, previously eager to serve as Anastasia's lady's maid, requested reassignment to other duties with obvious reluctance but firm determination. Even the household's social connections were being severed as servants sought positions that wouldn't compromise their own standing within the domestic community that paralleled New York's elite society. The evening brought no respite as the Whitmore family gathered for dinner in their elegant dining room, the conversation struggling to avoid acknowledgement of the crisis that consumed their thoughts, while the empty chairs around their table seemed to emphasize their growing isolation. Cornelius attempted to discuss business matters with his usual enthusiasm, but his words felt hollow against the weight of their personal catastrophe. Eleanor's efforts to plan for future social events rang with desperate hope that no one truly believed, while Anastasia participated in the charade with a composure that required every ounce of her remaining strength to maintain. The night concluded with each family member retreating to private quarters, where they could finally abandon the pretense of optimism that had sustained them through the day's fresh disasters, their separate solitudes serving as preparation for the even greater trials that awaited them in the morning, when society's judgment would be delivered with even greater finality. The arrival of Duke Alessandro di Monterosso in New York society caused a sensation that reached even the Whitmore household, his European title and mysterious circumstances creating exactly the kind of distraction that desperate families had learned to exploit. Eleanor Whitmore seized upon the news with the fervor of a drowning woman grasping for salvation, her mind immediately calculating how this unexpected development might provide an opportunity for her daughter's redemption. The Duke's presence represented possibilities that hadn't existed before. Foreign nobility, often operating under different social rules that might prove more forgiving of circumstances that American society found unacceptable. Anastasia herself felt a mixture of hope and terror at the prospect of encountering someone who might not have been poisoned against her by the whispered campaigns that had destroyed her local prospects. Yet she understood that any approach would need to be executed with perfect precision to avoid another devastating rejection. Her research into European marriage customs had revealed that continental nobility sometimes prioritized alliance and fortune over fertility, their dynastic concerns occasionally overriding the biological imperatives that dominated American social calculations. The possibility that different standards might apply offered a glimmer of hope that she scarcely dared to acknowledge even to herself. The Duke's first appearance at Mrs. Belmont's reception provided Anastasia with her initial opportunity to observe the man who might represent her salvation, his presence commanding attention in ways that confirmed both his authentic nobility and his dangerous unpredictability. Alessandro di Monterosso possessed the kind of dark Mediterranean beauty that made American mothers both excited and nervous. His obvious sophistication, suggesting depths of experience that their daughters had never encountered. His conversation revealed education and refinement that surpassed even New York's most accomplished gentlemen, while his apparent indifference to local social hierarchies suggested that he might be immune to the prejudices that had destroyed Anastasia's prospects. Eleanor's attempts to engineer an introduction required delicate maneuvering through social circles that had recently closed their doors to the Whitmore family, her efforts demanding every favor she had accumulated during decades of careful relationship building. Mrs. Belmont's reluctant cooperation came at the cost of future obligations that Eleanor couldn't afford, but felt compelled to accept, the price of desperation being measured in social debts that might never be repaid. The complexity of arranging what should have been a simple introduction emphasized how completely their family's position had deteriorated, while simultaneously highlighting the magnitude of the opportunity that the Duke's presence represented. The Duke's apparent interest in American customs and business practices provided Cornelius with an unexpected avenue for establishing contact. Their conversations about shipping and international trade, creating opportunities for more personal discussions that might eventually include his daughter. Alessandro's questions about New York society revealed both genuine curiosity and a sophisticated understanding of social dynamics that suggested he was well aware of the undercurrents that governed elite interactions. His careful observations about American marriage customs indicated that he understood exactly what forces were operating beneath the surface of polite conversation. Anastasia's first direct encounter with the Duke occurred during an afternoon reception where his attention seemed genuinely focused on her musical performance, his appreciation appearing authentic rather than merely polite in ways that she had almost forgotten were possible. Their conversation afterward revealed intellectual compatibility that had been absent from her interactions with American suitors, his knowledge of literature and art providing common ground that transcended the biological considerations that had dominated her recent social experiences. The realization that someone might value her mind and accomplishments over her reproductive capacity felt revolutionary after months of being reduced to nothing more than her medical circumstances. The development of what appeared to be genuine friendship between Anastasia and the Duke created ripples of speculation throughout New York society, their association being analyzed and dissected by the same women who had previously written off her matrimonial prospects entirely. Mrs. Astor herself was observed watching their interactions with the calculating intensity of someone reassessing previous judgments, while other prominent matrons began to reconsider whether European nobility might operate under sufficiently different rules to make Anastasia's circumstances irrelevant. The possibility that their family's social death might not be permanent began to seem almost believable for the first time in months. Alessandro's behavior toward Anastasia differed markedly from the careful avoidance that had characterized her recent interactions with eligible men, his obvious enjoyment of her company serving as a public rejection of society's verdict against her. His requests for her partnership in dancing, his attention during conversations, and his apparent indifference to the whispered warnings that surely reached his ears all suggested that he might indeed represent the salvation that her family had barely dared to hope for. The gradual restoration of respectful treatment from others who observed their growing connection provided the first positive social feedback that Anastasia had received in over a year. The Duke's inquiries about Anastasia's family history and personal circumstances forced Eleanor to confront the delicate question of how much truth to reveal about her daughter's medical situation, the decision requiring a careful balance between honesty and strategy that could determine their entire future. Alessandro's European sophistication suggested that he might be more understanding of circumstances that American society found unacceptable, but the risk of another devastating rejection made complete candor feel impossibly dangerous. The conversations proceeded with careful indirection, as both families attempted to assess the other's true intentions, without revealing information that might prove damaging. The growing attachment between Anastasia and Alessandro began to attract attention that felt both promising and threatening, their relationship developing under the intense scrutiny of a society that had already demonstrated its capacity for cruel judgment. Former friends who had recently avoided her began to seek opportunities for conversation, their renewed interest obviously motivated by curiosity about the Duke's intentions, rather than any genuine concern for her welfare. The calculation in their approaches reminded Anastasia that even apparent salvation might prove temporary if society's fundamental attitudes toward her circumstances hadn't actually changed. The pressure of maintaining hope while protecting herself from potential devastation began to take its toll on Anastasia's emotional reserves, each positive interaction with the Duke requiring her to believe in possibilities that previous experience had taught her to distrust. The careful balance between optimism and self-protection felt increasingly difficult to maintain as their relationship deepened, her heart beginning to invest in outcomes that reason suggested she shouldn't allow herself to expect. The knowledge that disappointment might prove even more devastating than her previous rejections made every moment of happiness feel simultaneously precious and dangerous. As the social season progressed toward its climax, the question of the Duke's ultimate intentions began to dominate every gathering where he appeared with Anastasia, their partnership in the complex dance of courtship being observed and analyzed by experts in matrimonial strategy who understood exactly what stakes were involved for everyone concerned. The evening of Mrs. Vanderbilt's grand ball arrived with the weight of a final judgment. The guest list representing the pinnacle of New York society's autumn season, and the last opportunity for definitive social positioning before the winter's more intimate gatherings. Anastasia prepared for what everyone understood might be her final appearance in elite circles, her Worth gown of deep sapphire silk serving as armor against the verdict that awaited her in the mansion's glittering ballroom. The knowledge that Duke Alessandro would be present had sustained her through weeks of mounting tension. But now the prospect of public resolution filled her with terror that threatened to overwhelm the careful composure she had cultivated through months of social warfare. Eleanor Whitmore's hands trembled as she fastened her daughter's diamond necklace, the family jewels seeming to mock their current circumstances with their inherited brilliance that could no longer guarantee social acceptance. Their carriage ride through the gaslit streets of Manhattan proceeded in silence heavy with unspoken fears, each family member lost in private calculations about what the evening might bring and what they could survive if hope once again proved illusory. The sight of other carriages converging on the Vanderbilt mansion emphasized the magnitude of the gathering that would serve as their social tribunal. New York's most powerful families assembling to witness what might prove to be either Anastasia's redemption or her final exile. The ballroom's opulent splendor felt overwhelming as the Whitmore family made their entrance, every crystal chandelier and gilded surface reflecting light that seemed to illuminate their vulnerability for all to observe. Mrs. Vanderbilt's greeting carried undertones of calculation that suggested even their hostess remained uncertain about how the evening would conclude, her carefully neutral demeanor providing no indication of whether the family could expect support or abandonment from someone who had once been their close friend. The assembled guests seemed to part before them like a human sea, creating a pathway that led inexorably toward whatever confrontation awaited them in the evening's orchestrated drama. Duke Alessandro's presence commanded the ballroom center with natural authority that reminded everyone present of the authentic nobility that American society both envied and desperately sought to emulate, his conversations with prominent families revealing the diplomatic skill that had made him such a sought-after guest throughout the social season. His acknowledgement of the Whitmore family's arrival carried weight that every observer immediately recognized. The depth of his bow to Eleanor and the duration of his attention to Anastasia serving as public declarations of intent that could no longer be dismissed as mere continental courtesy. The ballroom's energy seemed to focus around their interaction, as if everyone present understood that history was being written in their carefully choreographed exchange. The orchestra's opening waltz provided the first test of the evening's ultimate direction, as Alessandro approached Anastasia with the confidence of a man whose intentions had crystallized into action, his request for her partnership in the dance, serving as a gauntlet thrown down before every person who had participated in her social destruction. Their movement across the polished floor felt like a declaration of war against the forces that had conspired to deny her the life she deserved. Each perfectly executed step serving as evidence that some forms of worth transcended the narrow calculations that had previously defined her value. The sight of couples yielding space to accommodate their passage suggested that power dynamics within the ballroom were shifting in ways that no one had anticipated. Mrs. Astor's appearance at the gathering carried special significance that everyone present immediately recognized. Her presence serving as official sanction for whatever drama was about to unfold, while her careful positioning near the ballroom's center indicated her intention to observe every nuance of the evening's crucial developments. Her previous rejection of the Whitmore family had been delivered with such finality that any reversal would require explanations that might prove embarrassing for someone accustomed to having her social judgments accepted without question. The tension between maintaining her established position and accommodating new circumstances created an atmosphere of uncertainty that seemed to energize the entire gathering. The moment of ultimate truth arrived with shocking suddenness, as Duque Alessandro concluded their waltz by retaining Anastasia's hand while turning to address the assembled company, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom with authority that commanded immediate attention from every person present. His declaration of intent pierced the evening's carefully maintained social veneer like a sword thrust through silk, his announcement that he sought Anastasia Whitmore's hand in marriage stunning the gathering into absolute stillness. The proposal's public nature transformed what might have been a private family matter into a social revolution that challenged every assumption upon which New York's elite society had built its rigid hierarchical structure. The ballroom's reaction unfolded in waves of shock that rippled outward from the couple at its center, conversation stopping mid-sentence as the implications of Alessandro's announcement began to penetrate the consciousness of guests who had never imagined that their social certainties might prove so vulnerable to challenge. Mrs. Vanderbilt's expression revealed her struggle to process developments that threatened to overturn the careful calculations upon which she had built the evening's guest list. While other prominent hostesses exchanged glances that acknowledged their sudden uncertainty about how to respond to circumstances that their social experience had never prepared them to encounter. Anastasia herself felt the world transform around her as Alessandro's words continued to echo through the silent ballroom. Her previous existence as a social pariah suddenly revealed as merely temporary exile that could be ended by the will of someone with sufficient power to challenge society's verdicts. The realization that her worthiness had never truly been in question, that only society's cruel limitations had created her suffering, struck her with force that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. The knowledge that she was about to become the wife of a duke, that her children would inherit both title and position that surpassed anything American society could offer, felt like resurrection from a death that had seemed absolute and permanent. Eleanor Whitmore's tears of relief and triumph flowed freely as she watched her daughter's transformation from social outcast to future duchess unfold before the same gathering that had previously participated in Anastasia's humiliation. The reversal so complete and so public that it served as vindication for every mother who had ever feared society's judgment of her children. Cornelius stood straighter than he had in months, his business connections and financial resources suddenly relevant again as the father of a woman who would soon hold one of Europe's most ancient titles. The family's salvation had arrived with such dramatic force that even their previous suffering began to seem worthwhile as preparation for the triumph they were now experiencing. The evening's remainder proceeded like a dream sequence, where reality had been fundamentally altered by a few carefully chosen words. The same people who had shunned Anastasia now competing for her attention with transparent desperation that emphasized how completely their social calculations had been overturned. Mrs. Astor herself approached to offer congratulations with grace that barely concealed her shock at discovering that her social verdict could be appealed to a higher authority. Her acknowledgement of Anastasia's new status serving as official recognition that the established order had been permanently disrupted. As midnight approached, and the formal announcement of the engagement was made with all the ceremony that such occasions demanded, Anastasia found herself standing at the center of a social revolution that had transformed her from victim to victor in the space of a single evening. her future duchess title serving as proof that some forms of worth transcended even the cruelest limitations that society could impose upon those who dared to believe in possibilities beyond their current circumstances. The morning newspapers proclaimed Anastasia's engagement with headlines that read like fairy tales transcribed into social reality, their coverage transforming her from yesterday's cautionary example into today's romantic inspiration with the literary efficiency that only professional journalists could achieve. The same columnists who had previously dismissed her prospects now competed to craft the most elegant prose celebrating her unexpected triumph, their sudden reversal serving as a masterclass in society's capacity for revisionist history, when circumstances demanded tactical adjustments to previously held positions. Eleanor Whitmore read each account with satisfaction that bordered on vindictive pleasure, savoring every word that validated her years of unwavering faith in her daughter's ultimate worthiness. The Whitmore mansion experienced a resurrection that seemed to defy natural law, as calling cards and invitations began arriving with the same frequency they had once enjoyed during Anastasia's debut season, the silver salvers in their entrance hall groaning under the weight of social correspondence from families who had recently found her presence inconvenient. Mrs. Belmont's invitation to an intimate dinner party arrived with apologies for the previous season's scheduling conflicts, while the Astor family requested the honor of hosting a reception celebrating the engagement with enthusiasm that suggested their previous rejection had been merely a temporary misunderstanding. The domestic staff moved through the mansion with renewed energy as they prepared for the social rehabilitation that their employer's triumph had made both possible and inevitable. Duke Alessandro's presence in the Whitmore household transformed the family's daily routines into exercises in continental sophistication, as he shared stories of European court life that made New York society seem provincial by comparison, his casual references to crowned heads and ancient privileges putting their recent social struggles into perspective that emphasized how limited their previous horizons had actually been. His obvious devotion to Anastasia provided daily proof that her worth had never been in question among those sophisticated enough to recognize true quality, while his plans for their future life together painted pictures of existence that surpassed anything she had ever dared to imagine for herself. The Duke's matter-of-fact assumption that she would flourish in European society served as powerful medicine for confidence that had been systematically destroyed by months of American rejection. The engagement's social implications rippled through New York's elite circles like seismic waves, forcing fundamental reassessments of hierarchies and relationships that had seemed permanently established until Alessandro's proposal revealed their vulnerability to challenge from unexpected directions. Families who had participated in Anastasia's social exile now faced the uncomfortable prospect of explaining their previous behavior to someone who would soon outrank them all. Their attempts at reconciliation requiring delicate negotiations that acknowledged past wrongs without admitting to the intentional cruelty that everyone understood had motivated their actions. The mathematical precision of their social calculations, so recently used to exclude her, now worked in Anastasia's favor as everyone computed the advantages of maintaining good relations with a future duchess. Dr. Pemberton's professional reputation underwent subtle but significant modification as word spread that his medical verdict regarding Anastasia's fertility might have been premature or incomplete, the Duke's obvious confidence in their future family suggesting that European medical science possessed knowledge that American physicians lacked. The doctor found himself fielding discreet inquiries from other prominent families about the possibility of second opinions for daughters whose prospects might have been similarly damaged by hasty diagnoses, his responses necessarily cautious as he navigated the treacherous waters between medical integrity and social pressure. The transformation of his patient from social pariah to future nobility provided an uncomfortable reminder that medicine existed within society rather than above it. Anastasia's own metamorphosis from rejected spinster to celebrated bride-to-be required psychological adjustments that proved more challenging than the external changes in her circumstances, her self-perception struggling to accommodate the reality that she was now envied rather than pitied by the same women who had previously dismissed her entirely. The careful armor of emotional protection that she had constructed during months of social warfare couldn't be easily discarded, leaving her occasionally suspicious of attention, that was now genuine rather than calculated. Her conversations with Alessandro helped her understand that her perceived deficiency had always been society's limitation, rather than her own. But accepting that truth required dismantling defense mechanisms that had become essential to her psychological survival. The practical preparations for a wedding that would unite American commerce with European nobility demanded coordination between two continents, as the Duke's family began communicating their expectations for ceremonies that would properly honor both traditions and titles involved in the alliance. Alessandro's casual mention of royal family members who would attend their nuptials transformed what might have been merely elaborate New York social events into diplomatic occasions that would establish the Whitmore family's position in international circles that had previously been beyond their most ambitious dreams. Eleanor found herself corresponding with Italian countesses and French duchesses, whose very existence had been theoretical before her daughter's engagement made such connections not just possible, but necessary. The wedding's guest list became a document of social significance that extended far beyond personal celebration, as families competed for inclusion in what promised to be the season's most important gathering. Their previous treatment of the bride serving as inconvenient obstacles to the access they now desperately desired. Mrs. Vanderbilt's request to host pre-wedding festivities came with offers of unprecedented hospitality, while other prominent hostesses began planning competing events that might attract the Duke's attention to their own unmarried daughters. The irony that Anastasia's triumph had transformed her from social liability into valuable social asset wasn't lost on anyone involved in the elaborate negotiations surrounding wedding preparations. The Duke's business discussions with Cornelius Whitmore revealed opportunities for international trade partnerships that had been impossible before the family's elevation to nobility, their commercial conversations taking on diplomatic dimensions that suggested future profits might be measured in more than mere financial terms. Alessandro's knowledge of European markets and political developments provided insights that American businessmen rarely accessed, while his family connections opened doors that money alone couldn't unlock. The realization that their daughter's marriage would transform their business prospects as dramatically as their social position provided Cornelius with satisfaction that went beyond mere parental pride. Anastasia's final fittings for her wedding gown became ceremonies of transformation as Worth's most skilled seamstresses crafted garments that would be worn by someone destined to become European nobility. Their attention to detail reflecting the international significance of occasions where she would represent both American and Italian interests. The sapphire tiara that Alessandro presented as his engagement gift had belonged to his family for 3 centuries, its placement upon her head serving as physical symbol of the metamorphosis that had carried her from social exile to continental aristocracy. The weight of ancient jewels against her temples provided constant reminder that she was no longer merely Anastasia Whitmore of New York, but the future Duchess de Monterosso, whose children would inherit titles that predated the founding of the American Republic. The approaching wedding date created urgency that transformed the autumn social season into a prolonged celebration of romantic triumph over social adversity. Each pre-wedding event serving as another opportunity for former enemies to demonstrate their newfound appreciation for the bride, whose worthiness had been vindicated by forces beyond their capacity to challenge or control. The same ballrooms that had witnessed her humiliation now hosted receptions in her honor, their music seeming to play different melodies now that she listened as someone whose future had been secured by authentic love rather than social calculation. The morning of Anastasia's wedding dawned with December snow that transformed New York into a crystalline wonderland, worthy of the fairy tale ending that her life had become. The city's harsh edges softened by nature's own celebration of her triumph over circumstances that had once seemed insurmountable. Grace Church stood like a Gothic poem written in stone and snow, its bells pealing across Manhattan with proclamations of joy that seemed to reach every corner of the society that had both rejected and ultimately embraced the bride who would soon become the Duchess de Monterosso. The crowds gathering outside the church included not just invited guests, but curious citizens drawn by newspaper accounts of the romance that had captured the city's imagination. Their presence transforming a private ceremony into a public celebration of love's victory over social prejudice. Inside the church's hallowed spaces, New York's most prominent families assembled to witness what many considered the social event of the decade. their presence serving as collective acknowledgement that Alessandro's proposal had fundamentally altered the balance of power within elite circles. Mrs. Caroline Astor herself occupied a place of honor that represented her public blessing of a union she had previously worked to prevent. Her transformation from opponent to supporter, providing visible proof of nobility's capacity to overrule even the most entrenched social judgments. The same women who had whispered about Anastasia's unsuitability now competed to offer the most elegant compliments about her radiant beauty, their enthusiasm genuine despite its obvious calculation. Eleanor Whitmore's tears of joy flowed freely as she watched her daughter's preparation in the church's bridal chamber. The Worth gown of ivory silk and Venetian lace transforming Anastasia into a vision of perfection that vindicated every sacrifice their family had endured during the dark months of social exile. The ancient Monterosso tiara caught the morning light streaming through stained glass windows, its sapphires and diamonds creating coronets of colored light that seemed to dance around the bride's face like visual prayers of thanksgiving. The knowledge that her daughter would spend her honeymoon in European palaces rather than American drawing rooms provided Eleanor with satisfaction that transcended mere social triumph. Duke Alessandro waited at the altar with the confidence of a man whose love had proven stronger than societal conventions, his presence commanding the church's attention, while simultaneously focusing entirely upon the woman whose worth he had recognized when others could see only perceived deficiency. His family's representative, the Count di Savoia, had arrived from Italy specifically for the ceremony, bringing papal blessings and family jewels that emphasized the international significance of a marriage that united American commerce with European nobility. The Duke's obvious happiness served as visible rebuke to everyone who had suggested that his proposal represented charity rather than genuine affection. The ceremony's musical selections included compositions by Italian masters whose works would soon provide the soundtrack to Anastasia's new life, their melodies carrying her beyond the limitations that had defined her existence in New York society, toward possibilities that seemed infinite in their promise. The choir's voices soared through the church's vaulted spaces, with anthems of celebration that transformed personal joy into communal expression of hope, their harmonies suggesting that love could indeed conquer circumstances that reason suggested were insurmountable. The organ's triumphant chords seemed to announce not just a wedding, but a revolution in social thinking that would benefit countless future generations. Anastasia's walk down the aisle represented more than mere bridal procession as she moved from her American past toward her European future, each step carrying her further from the woman who had been rejected by narrow-minded society toward the Duchess who would command respect from the world's most sophisticated circles. The faces of guests who had participated in her social exile now reflected admiration that acknowledged her transformation from victim to victor, their expressions serving as public apology for judgments that had proven both cruel and incorrect. Her father's pride radiated through his careful composure as he prepared to give his daughter to a man whose love had rescued her from circumstances that had seemed beyond redemption. The exchange of vows proceeded with solemnity that acknowledged both the personal significance of promises being made and the public importance of an alliance that would elevate American social standards while providing European nobility with access to New World prosperity. Alessandro's voice carried across the hushed congregation with declarations of love that left no doubt about his commitment to a woman whose worth had been invisible to less perceptive observers, his Italian accent lending musical quality to English words that bound their futures together. Anastasia's responses rang with confidence that had been rebuilt through months of his unwavering devotion, her voice strong enough to reach every corner of the church where former enemies now served as witnesses to her vindication. The blessing pronounced upon their union by the church's most senior clergy carried weight that extended beyond religious ceremony into social absolution, the formal recognition of their marriage serving to permanently erase any questions about Anastasia's worthiness for the position she would now occupy. The rings exchanged between bride and groom had been crafted by Italian masters, whose artistry would bind their love in gold that had adorned nobility for generations, their precious metals serving as tangible symbols of permanence in a world where social positions had proven surprisingly fragile. The final pronouncement that transformed Miss Anastasia Whitmore into the Duchess de Monterosso echoed through the church like a judgment that overruled every previous verdict society had rendered against her. The recessional carried the newly married couple toward their carriage amid showers of rice and flower petals that transformed their departure into a celebration of triumph over adversity. The crowds cheering with genuine enthusiasm for a romance that had captured imaginations throughout the city. Their progress through Manhattan's snow-covered streets became a victory parade that announced the dawn of new possibilities for anyone brave enough to believe that social conventions could be challenged by those with sufficient courage and authentic worth. The journey to their wedding reception provided opportunities for private moments where Alessandro could remind his bride that her value had never been in question among those sophisticated enough to recognize true quality. The reception at the Vanderbilt mansion achieved legendary status before it concluded. The gathering serving as official celebration of social revolution that had transformed rejection into triumph through the simple expedient of recognizing worth that had always existed beneath society's limited vision. The same ballroom where Anastasia had endured her most devastating humiliations now hosted festivities in her honor, the space's transformation serving as metaphor for possibilities that awaited anyone who refused to accept society's verdict as final judgment. The evening's toasts acknowledged not just personal happiness, but the broader lesson that authentic nobility recognized authentic worth, regardless of circumstances that lesser minds found insurmountable. As the Duke and Duchess prepared for their departure to European honeymoon destinations that would introduce Anastasia to the continental society where she would soon take her place among history's most distinguished women, their farewell to American shores carried the satisfaction of victory, achieved through perseverance rather than compromise. The knowledge that their children would inherit titles and opportunities that surpassed anything available in the New World provided comfort for the distance that would separate them from families who had supported them through society's cruelest trials. Their future stretched ahead with promise that transformed past suffering into prologue for lives that would be remembered long after the small minds that had opposed them were forgotten. The final image of their carriage disappearing into the snowy night carried symbolic weight that would inspire future generations of young women who faced similar challenges. Their example proving that social conventions could be overcome by those who maintained faith in their own worth while waiting for love sophisticated enough to recognize their true value. Anastasia's transformation from rejected spinster to celebrated duchess provided hope for anyone who had ever been dismissed by circumstances beyond their control, her story serving as proof that patience and authenticity would ultimately triumph over prejudice and narrow thinking. If this story has touched your heart and reminded you that true worth is never diminished by others' limited vision, please subscribe to our channel for more tales of triumph over adversity that prove love and courage can overcome any obstacle society places in our path.